All right, let me put the papers right side up. Good afternoon. Just a reminder that at 2 p.m. this afternoon, there'll be a briefing here organized by the UN Mine Action Service. Speakers will include Thomas Contogiorgios, Chief of the Office of Disarmament, Demobilization, Reintegration in the Office of the Peacekeeping Department, and Mai Shaheen of Combatants for Peace, and an activist named Iris Gore. Also, the Secretary General's press conference that was supposed to happen Thursday will not happen Thursday. As soon as I have a new schedule, I will let you know. As soon as I have something to let you know, schedule, I will let you know. As soon as I have more information, I will let you know. All right. Turning to the Democratic Republic of the Congo, this morning the Secretary General spoke by phone in two separate calls, one with President Felix Tshisekedi of the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and then with President Paul Kagame of Rwanda. Obviously, they discussed the ongoing situation in the eastern part of the Democratic Republic of the Congo. In his call with President Kagame, there was also a special emphasis on the need to protect civilians in that area. This afternoon at 3 p.m., the Security Council will reconvene in a session on the Congo. On our side, Viviane van de Peer, the Deputy Special Representative for operations in the UN peacekeeping operation in MONUSCO, will brief the Security Council. She will be briefing via video link from Goma itself. On the ground, obviously, as you can imagine, the situation in Goma remains tense and rather fluid. M23 forces, we are told, are inside the city, and UN peacekeeping personnel and troops have largely been forced to shelter in their bases. Medical facilities in Goma are reportedly overwhelmed, and essential services have obviously been disrupted. Currently, as far as we know, the M23 forces control the airport, and there are real risks of breakdown of law and order in the city given the proliferation of weapons. The mission has also been seen credible reports of prisoners who've escaped from the prison in Goma, as well as looting by civilians. Non-essential UN personnel have been temporarily relocated from Goma and the surrounding area. The movement of essential supplies and personnel is obviously an urgent concern. Armed clashes continue in multiple regions, including in Masisi and Rutshuru and Nyiragongo. All those clashes are further displacing civilians and complicating our humanitarian efforts, to say the least. Our peacekeeping colleagues also report that protests in Kinshasa over the ongoing situation in the Democratic Republic of the Congo have turned violent, with demonstrators setting fire outside of UN premises, both the peacekeeping and some of our agencies, as well as targeting several embassies. Looting has also been reported in Kinshasa. For its part, our colleagues at the Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs tell us that the humanitarian situation in and around Goma remain worrying. Hospitals in Goma continue to be overwhelmed, struggling to manage the influx of wounded people. 2 ambulances from a local NGO were targeted in Goma today while attempting to evacuate wounded people. According to our humanitarian partners, there are also reports of gender-based violence, the looting of property, including several humanitarian warehouses, and humanitarian and health facilities also struck in the fighting. Electricity and water supplies are still disrupted. The phone network is operational, but we are told that the internet is not fully functioning. OCHA also reiterates that all parties must do all they can to spare civilians in military operations. Schools, hospitals, and other civilian infrastructures must be protected. If the situation remains calm tomorrow, we expect aid workers to resume their efforts to respond to the enormous humanitarian needs. For its part, our colleagues at the World Food Program tell us that access to food in Goma has been impacted. They remain focused on supporting the 7.1 million people most vulnerable, especially the women, men, and children. They also aim to resume delivering assistance as soon as circumstances allow. We will make Ms. van der Peer remarks available to you, and we expect her to share a lot more operational details when she briefs. A number of you have asked me about a letter from the United States concerning the Paris Climate Agreement, and I can confirm to you that the United States has notified the Secretary General in his capacity as depository of its withdrawal on January 27th of this year from the Paris Agreement, which, as you recall, was signed on December 12th, 2015, or was agreed to on December 12th, 2015. The United States had signed the Paris Agreement on 22nd April 2016 and expressed its consent to be bound by the agreement by acceptance on 3rd September 2016. It then withdrew from the agreement effective on November 4th, 2020, before accepting it again on February 19th, 2021. According to Article 28, Paragraph 2 of the Paris Agreement, the withdrawal of the United States will take effect on January 27th, 2026. We reaffirm our commitment to the Paris Agreement and support all effective efforts to limit the rise in global temperatures to 1.5 degrees Celsius. Our Deputy Secretary General Amina Mohammed attended today the second and final day of the Africa Energy Summit, which is taking place in Tanzania. In her opening remarks, she called on African leaders to she called on African leaders present to advance energy access by 2030. To realize this vision, the Deputy Secretary General stressed the need for strong institutions, effective multilateral cooperation, and investments from the public and private sectors to scale up implementation of energy projects. The Deputy Secretary General engaged with heads of states and government, ministers, and other high-level officials and representatives to discuss cooperation with the United Nations toward the achievement of the 2030 Agenda and the Paris Agreement. She's on her way back home to New York as we speak. Back here, you heard from Philippe Lazzarini, the Commissioner General of UNRWA. He briefed the Security Council. He told the council members that in 2 days, UNRWA's operations in the occupied Palestinian territory will be crippled as the Israeli Knesset legislation takes effect. He said the full implementation of the Knesset's legislation would be disastrous, adding that it will degrade the capacity of the UN just when humanitarian assistance must be scaled up significantly. The Knesset legislation, Mr. Lazzarini said, defies resolutions of the Security Council and the General Assembly. It flouts the rulings of the International Court of Justice, and the Commissioner General added that UNRWA staff is determined to stay and deliver until it is no longer able to do so. Mr. Lazzarini called on council members to push back against the implementation of the Knesset legislation, to insist on a genuine political path forward that delineates UNRWA's role as a provider of education and health care, and to ensure that a financial crisis does not abruptly end UNRWA's life-saving work. Turning to the situation on the ground in Gaza, our humanitarian colleagues tell us that our humanitarian partners are seizing every opportunity created by the ceasefire to provide critical life-saving services to people in all 5 governorates. OCHA reports that aid groups continue to provide food, health care, and other humanitarian services to people returning to northern Gaza. As of earlier today, our partners estimate that more than 375,000 people have crossed from south to north since the opening yesterday of the Coastal Road and the Salah-al-Din Road. Aid workers deployed along those roads are providing those on the move with water, hot meals, high-energy biscuits, hygiene kits, and emergency medical care as needed. They're also warning people of the danger posed by unexploded ordnances. The UN Mine Action Service and its partners have also assessed nearly a dozen sites across Gaza to reduce the risk that explosive ordnances pose to civilians, including humanitarian personnel. Meanwhile, the World Food Program tells us that during the first week of the ceasefire, the agency has reached more than 330,000 people across Gaza with food assistance, including food parcels, hot meals, cash assistance. WFP says it has brought more than 10,000 metric tons of food into Gaza since the ceasefire, and for the first time in months, families in Gaza are receiving significantly more rations. 2 food parcels, and a 25-kilo bag of wheat flour. The agency is also distributing nutrition products to about 46,000 people, including children under 5 and pregnant and breastfeeding women. Thanks to the influx of fresh supplies entering the Strip, the World Food Program has also been able to get bakeries up and running in the southern part of Gaza, 8 previously existing bakeries and 5 new ones, and they've also been able to prepare hot meals and deliver ready-to-eat meals to families that are in shelters and not able to go get the food. The Food and Agricultural Organization, for its part, tells us it's working to restore local food production in Gaza by scaling up deliveries of critical agricultural inputs. The agency says the agency's latest geospatial assessment, carried out with the UN Satellite Center between October and December of last year, indicates that 3/4 of fields once used to grow crops in Gaza, as well as olive orchards, have been damaged or destroyed. Livestock loss is estimated at 96%, and the fishing sector is on the brink of collapse. Meanwhile, in the West Bank, our humanitarian colleagues tell us they're deeply concerned over the impact of ongoing operations by Israeli forces in Jenin and most recently in Tulkarem. Yesterday, airstrikes were reported in Tulkarem, resulting in further fatalities. Since the beginning of the operations in Jenin, 18 people have been killed in both governorates. OCHA warns that the use of warlike tactics by Israeli security forces appears to exceed law enforcement standards. In Jenin, the World Food Program tells us they are ready to provide food vouchers and assistance to more than 3,700 people there. WFP is also helping to get cash assistance to thousands of displaced households affected by military operations in the West Bank. Turning north to Syria, the Office of the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs tells us that needs across the country remain massive. We, along with our humanitarian partners, need 1.2 billion United States dollars to reach 6.7 million of the most vulnerable people through March of this year. This includes providing 5.4 million people with food aid, 3 million people with health care, and 2.5 million people with clean water and sanitation. OCHA tells us that continued hostilities in the northeast of the country impact our efforts to deliver aid, particularly in eastern Aleppo and the Al-Raqqa governorates. The Tishrin Dam in Aleppo, which we've been talking to you about, has been non-functional now for 7 weeks due to the hostilities that hamper our efforts to get partners to repair the dam, which is critical to access fresh water for residents in the area. In fact, it deprives more than 410,000 people of access to water and electricity in Menbij and the Ain al-Arab district of eastern Aleppo governorate. OCHA also tells us that last week, intensified hostilities in Menbij forced 25,000 men, women, and children to flee their homes. And in the northeast, at least some 24,000 displaced people living in more than 200 emergency collective centers in the region. Our partners report more than 50,000 children, including those living with disabilities, have no access to education due to their schools being used as collective centers. And as a reminder, Syria continues to host one of the world's largest displaced populations, and some of 40% of those targeted with aid are internally displaced. And second to last note is on another tragic humanitarian situation and one of the worst in the world, and that is Sudan. And our colleagues at UNICEF tell us that at least 1 girl and 3 boys were reportedly killed in the attack that took place on Friday in the Saudi hospital in El Fasher. 3 boys were also reportedly injured. The children were among the patients receiving care in the hospital's emergency ward, being treated for injuries resulting from previous bombings in the area. UNICEF says it's an illustration of the relentless dangers that children face in conflict zones. Hospitals are the very places where they should be safest from harm. In Sudan, more than 70% of the hospitals in the areas that are witnessing hostilities are currently non-operational due to damage, due to destruction, or lack of supplies, or just for being used as shelters or other purposes. We remind, once again, that all parties to the conflict of their obligations to ensure the protection of civilians, including children. We now have 31 countries on the honor roll, and all I will say is that the boss's country paid its dues. Yes, very good. That was easy.